It started with a 911 call on a rainy Tuesday morning. "There's a dog on Route 19," the woman said breathlessly. "He's running down the middle of the highway. I almost hit him." The dispatcher was used to calls like that. Strays were common along the stretch of rural road that cut through the forest just outside Madison Falls. Usually raccoons, sometimes deer. Occasionally, yes, a dog. But then came a second call, and a third. Within the hour, 6 different drivers had reported the same thing. A large German shepherd darting between lanes, wet, alone, focused. The strange part? No one had hit him. Every witness said the same thing. The dog would appear suddenly in the rain, run beside a car for a few seconds, then vanish into the woods, like he was trying to lead someone. Officer Kyle Moreno was the one sent to check it out. He didn't think much of it. Probably a farm dog that got loose. But when he pulled over by mile marker 73 and stepped out into the drizzle, he found nothing. No dog, no tracks. Just the quiet hiss of tires on wet asphalt and the low hum of wind through trees. He called it in and shrugged it off. That night, it happened again. This time, a school bus driver slammed on the brakes when the dog ran across the road in front of her. "He looked right at me," she said, "like he wanted me to follow." By Thursday, the sightings had tripled. People were talking on Facebook, in diners, at gas stations. Some joked about a ghost dog. Others called it an omen. A few swore they'd seen the same shepherd weeks ago just outside the highway tunnel. Then came the first photo. Blurry, shot from a phone in motion, but clear enough. A lean German shepherd, soaked and mud-streaked, staring down the lens with intense, intelligent eyes. The post went viral in the local community group. Dozens of comments. "That's the one I saw. He's not just running, he's guiding." "Has anyone tried to follow him?" Kyle started paying more attention. He pulled dashcam footage from a patrol car that had passed mile marker 73 around 2:15 a.m. The video showed nothing for 30 seconds, then a shape, low to the ground, ears up, a blur of movement in the rain, and then, in a single frame before the camera turned, the reflection of eyes in the dark. Still, his captain wasn't convinced. "We're not dog catchers, Kyle," she said. "Animal control's been notified." But something nagged at him. This wasn't just a stray. This dog was showing up in the same place at the same time every day, and always when it rained. That Friday, Kyle decided to stake it out himself. He parked near the trees off the shoulder, engine off, coffee in hand. The clouds rolled in just after sunset. The drizzle began around 8:30. By 9:15, the rain was steady. Headlights flickered down the long stretch of road. Then, out of the fog, the dog appeared. Kyle's breath caught in his throat. The shepherd moved like a ghost, low, fast, but intentional. He wasn't scared. He wasn't lost. He stopped in the middle of the road as a car approached, stared directly at it, then dashed away just before the tires could reach him. And just like that, he was gone. Kyle stepped out of the car. "Here, boy," he shouted into the night. Nothing. No sound but the trees. But when he turned back toward his vehicle, the dog was standing beside it, not 5 feet away, watching. They locked eyes. Kyle froze. The dog didn't growl, didn't flinch, just stared, chest rising and falling, soaked to the bone. Kyle took a cautious step forward. "It's okay, buddy," he said softly. "You're safe." The dog turned, walked slowly toward the woods, then paused, looked back, waited. Kyle hesitated, then followed. He didn't know why. He wasn't armed. He hadn't radioed anyone. but something in the dog's eyes had said, "Come with me." Branches scratched his coat. Mud clung to his boots. The dog trotted ahead, pausing every few yards to glance back, as if checking that Kyle was still there. They walked for maybe 10 minutes before the trees thinned. And then Kyle saw it. Twisted metal, shattered glass, a rusted sedan half buried in leaves and moss. The kind of wreck you wouldn't see from the road. The kind that had been there a long time. Kyle's heart pounded. The dog stopped beside the crumpled front door, then sat, waiting. Kyle approached the car, wiping grime from the window with his sleeve. Inside, vines snaked through the floorboards. The passenger seat was torn. Something glinted beneath the debris, a badge, a child's backpack, and then the unmistakable glint of bones. Kyle stumbled back. He grabbed his radio, voice shaking. "Dispatch, this is Officer Moreno. I need backup and a coroner. We've got a vehicle in the woods near mile 73. Possible remains inside. I was led here by the dog." There was silence on the line. Then, "Copy that, Moreno. Stay put." But the dog was already walking away, back toward the highway, back into the rain. Kyle called after him, "Wait, please." But the shepherd didn't turn around. He just disappeared into the trees. That night, Kyle stayed at the scene until the team arrived. Forensics confirmed it. The wreck belonged to Sandra Reyes, reported missing 12 years ago with her 6-year-old son, Miguel. Foul play had been suspected. The boyfriend had been questioned, but nothing was ever found. Until now. They recovered 2 sets of remains, but only one child's backpack. The second was missing. And the dog? Gone. No one saw him again that night, but Kyle knew he would return, because the dog hadn't led him there to finish something. He led him there to start it. They recovered the bodies in silence. The forest around them was still, as if holding its breath. Kyle stood with the coroner, watching the scene unfold like it was someone else's memory. 12 years. That car had sat beneath leaves and moss, invisible from the highway, practically swallowed by time. The missing woman, Sandra Reyes, had been a cold case so old most of the newer officers didn't even recognize her name when it hit the wire. But Kyle remembered. He'd been a rookie then, just 3 months into the job when the posters went up. Mother and son, last seen leaving a grocery store on a Friday evening. Her boyfriend was questioned, then released. The car was never found, until now. But something didn't add up. 2 sets of remains, the forensic tech confirmed, carefully pulling the items from the wreck. Adult female and 1 child. Kyle frowned, but she had a son and a daughter. The tech looked up. Records say she had 1 kid. Kyle shook his head. Number 2, a boy and a girl, twins, Miguel and Maribel. He remembered because he'd helped search the drainage ditches near their old apartment, spent hours combing through garbage behind strip malls. One of the flyers had stayed in his locker for months. He could still picture it, Miguel's round face beside Maribel's, both smiling through gap teeth. "Are you sure?" the tech asked. Kyle didn't answer. He just stepped back, mind racing. If only 2 sets of bones were in the car, and one of them was the mother. Where was Maribel? The rain returned the next day. Kyle barely slept. He filed the report, answered the press questions, gave the sheriff a full debrief. But his mind wasn't in it. All he could think about was the 3rd seat in that car, empty, and the dog. How had the German shepherd known? No tags, no collar, no microchip, no reports of anyone missing a dog matching that description. He wasn't just a stray. He moved like a soldier, eyes alert, calculated. And he didn't run from cars, he chased them, trying to get someone to follow. Kyle opened the old case file again, this time digging deeper. The original reports showed inconsistencies. Sandra Reyes had a restraining order filed 6 months before she disappeared, not against the boyfriend, but against an unnamed man listed only as V. It had never been followed up. No one knew who V was. Kyle highlighted the detail. Then he pulled up hospital records. 6 months prior to her disappearance, Sandra had taken Maribel to the ER for a fractured arm. Miguel had been listed on the intake forms too, for a sprained wrist. Child services had never been called. Another failure, another gap. And now a girl might still be out there, grown, alone, forgotten. Unless she didn't forget. Unless someone else hadn't let go. That afternoon, another call came in. Highway 19, same stretch, same time. A family in a minivan nearly swerved off the road when a German shepherd bolted in front of them. He wasn't chasing anything, the father said. He just stood there, staring. By the time Kyle arrived, the dog was gone again. But this time, there were prints. Not just paw prints, footprints, bare, small, leading from the edge of the trees toward the ditch where the car had been recovered, then veering off into the woods. Kyle followed the trail until it disappeared into wet leaves and underbrush. He stood still, straining to hear something, anything, and then there it was, a howl, low, long, echoing through the trees. Not a wolf, not a dog exactly either, something in between. Kyle's blood ran cold. The next night, he parked at the same mile marker again. The storm had rolled in stronger. Lightning danced on the horizon, illuminating the treetops in flickering flashes. Kyle left his engine off, window cracked, flashlight resting on the seat. Midnight passed. Then 12:17. He checked his watch. Then he saw them. First, the dog, emerging from the trees like a ghost again, rain beating off his thick coat, eyes locked on the road. But this time, he wasn't alone. Beside him walked a figure, small, hooded, barefoot. Kyle's hand went to his holster out of instinct, but he didn't move. The figure stepped into the road, turned toward him, and raised a hand. Not in fear, not in warning, just acknowledgement. Kyle stepped out of the car slowly, heart pounding. "Hello?" he called. No answer. The dog growled softly, not at Kyle, at the trees behind him. Kyle turned. Nothing. When he turned back, the figure was gone. The dog stood alone again, staring. Then, slowly, he backed away into the woods. Kyle barely slept. The image burned into his brain. A child, a real one. But how? Could Maribel have survived the crash and lived alone all these years? Number impossible. And yet, there were reports in the archives, unconfirmed sightings of a girl in the woods, campers who'd heard humming, a ranger who once found a necklace hanging from a tree branch, like an offering, kids daring each other to leave snacks on stumps. A legend, they called her. The wild girl of Route 19. But what if it wasn't a legend? What if Maribel had survived? What if the dog was protecting her? The next day, Kyle submitted a request for drone support. The sheriff denied it, said it was chasing shadows. So Kyle went rogue. He borrowed a thermal drone from a contact at the fire department, programmed it to scan the forest just off mile 73. He flew it slow, grid pattern, nothing. Then, on the fourth pass, a heat signature, faint, but there, huddled near a fallen log, barely visible beneath the canopy, human-shaped, and beside it, a larger form, warm, protective, alive. Kyle marked the coordinates. He knew what he had to do. Kyle entered the forest just after dawn. He didn't tell anyone, no radio, no backup, just his boots, a flashlight, and a printed satellite map marked with a red X, the heat signature from the night before. The trees swallowed him whole within minutes. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. No traffic, no birds, just the crunch of damp leaves beneath his steps and the pulse of his own heartbeat. He didn't call out. Something told him not to. He walked slowly, listening, scanning. After an hour, he found the fallen log. It was massive, likely an old oak split by lightning years ago. Moss covered its trunk like velvet. Kyle stepped around it and froze. There, in the shallow space between log and dirt, was a nest, not of twigs or leaves, blankets, worn, faded, arranged with care, empty, but not abandoned. There were items nearby, a cracked mirror, a plastic spoon, a shoe 3 sizes too small, a book with half the pages torn out. He knelt. Everything was old, weathered, but clearly used. Recently. Then he saw it, carved deep into the wood, jagged and rough, M+M and a paw print. Kyle stared in silence, the meaning sinking in. Miguel and Maribel? Or Maribel and the dog? He didn't have time to finish the thought before he heard it. A low growl behind him. He turned slowly. The German shepherd stood at the edge of the clearing. This time he wasn't alone. A girl, no, a young woman now, stood beside him, barefoot, eyes hollow but alert. She looked no older than 16, but Kyle knew she had to be at least 18 by now. Her clothes were a patchwork of scraps and forest fabric, sewn with long, clumsy stitches. Her face was streaked with mud. Her hands clutched a length of rope like a leash, but it wasn't attached to anything. She didn't move. Neither did the dog. Kyle held his hands out. "Maribel," he said gently, "it's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." Her expression didn't change. The dog stepped forward, placing himself between them. Kyle lowered himself slowly to one knee. "You've been out here a long time. I know what happened. The accident. Your mom. Your brother." Her jaw tightened. Her eyes flicked to the ground. "I saw your carving," he added. M+M. She didn't speak, but the dog let out a soft chuff, almost like permission, and that's when Kyle noticed the girl's hands, scarred, calloused, but strong, and around her neck hung a collar, old, worn, the brass tag barely readable, but Kyle saw it. Max. He froze. Maximum. A K-9 officer who went missing 12 years ago during a wilderness rescue near this same stretch of forest. The story was local legend, a state trooper's partner who ran off during a landslide while searching for a lost child. The trooper had never been found. The dog had disappeared. Until now. Kyle whispered, "You've been with her this whole time, haven't you?" The shepherd, Max, sat, guarding her still. Back in town, Kyle made a decision. He didn't report it. Not yet. He returned to the station, filed his standard reports, marked the drone footage as inconclusive, but every day he came back to the woods. Sometimes he left food, sometimes a book, sometimes nothing, just his presence. It took weeks, but one morning, as the frost lifted from the leaves and the sun finally warmed the clearing, she was there, waiting, sitting on the log. Max beside her, muzzle gray, but eyes sharp. Kyle sat across from her and said nothing. And for the first time, Maribel spoke. "His name is Max." Her voice was quiet. "Sandpaper on stone." Kyle nodded. "I know." She looked down at the dog. "He saved me." "I believe you." She looked back up. "You're the first one who didn't try to take me." "I'm not here to take you," he said. I'm here to listen." That conversation was the beginning. In time, she told him everything. The crash, how her mom had swerved to avoid a deer and the car had tumbled down the hill, how she'd woken up outside the car, alone, crying, how Max had appeared, bleeding, limping, and laid beside her that night, keeping her warm, how he never left, how he taught her, in his own way, how to survive, how she grew up with no language except what she remembered and what Max gave her, signals, sounds, silence. "He was my brother," she said once. "After Miguel was gone, he became everything." Kyle tried not to cry when she said it. Max was older now, slower, but he still guarded her like a soldier on duty. Eventually, Kyle convinced her to come with him, not to the station, but to a small cabin just beyond the tree line, owned by a retired ranger. Quiet, private, a place she could sleep on a mattress, eat warm food, learn to be part of the world again. Max stayed by her side until he couldn't. One morning, Kyle found her sitting alone on the porch. Max lay at her feet, still, his chest no longer rising, his eyes closed, peaceful. Kyle knelt beside her, said nothing. Maribel didn't cry. She just placed a hand on Max's head and whispered, "You found them. You did it." Then she looked at Kyle. "Now it's my turn." The media didn't find out for nearly 2 weeks. That was on purpose. Kyle didn't tell anyone except the sheriff, and even then, only after Maribel agreed. The sheriff, to her credit, didn't send cameras or press releases, just nodded slowly after Kyle finished the story, removed her glasses, and whispered, "My God." By the time the story reached the public, the framing had already been shaped. Survivor found after years missing in the wilderness. Mysterious dog helps girl survive alone in the woods. The ghost shepherd of Route 19 was real. But the headlines didn't come close to telling the full truth. Maribel Reyes had been alive for 12 years, hidden in the forest just beyond the highway where her mother's car had crashed. With her, the entire time, had been Max, a K-9 unit who had vanished during a rescue mission around the same time. The two had survived not just on instinct, but on each other. The town's reaction was mixed at first: shock, awe, disbelief. Then the questions began. Why didn't she come out sooner? Why didn't anyone find her? Could she speak? Was she normal? Kyle shielded her from most of it. He brought her books, helped her adjust slowly, taught her to use a smartphone, which she hated, and gently walked her through old memories. She remembered more than anyone expected. She remembered her brother, the crash, her mother's voice, and the first night when she lay shaking in the dark, and Max had pressed against her side and didn't move until morning. "He kept me human," she told Kyle once, "even when I forgot how to be one." They held a small ceremony for Max under the apple trees behind the ranger's station. Kyle carved a marker himself, MAXK 91139, Protector, Brother, Hero. Maribel spoke 3 words at the service. "He never left me." And then she placed a blue ribbon beside the stone, the same kind she used to wear in her hair before the world took everything from her. Weeks passed. Maribel met Sandra Reyes's sister, her only remaining relative. The woman wept the moment she saw her, wrapped her in a hug that felt like the closing of a book left unfinished for too long. Miguel's memory was honored at a church service with photos, candles, and soft music. Maribel stood in the back with Kyle, her hand in her jacket pocket, fingers gripping Max's tag like a talisman. "They were all looking for me," she said quietly, "but he was the only one who ever found me." The town changed after that. The dog that once haunted Highway 19 became a symbol, not of mystery, but of devotion. They renamed the mile marker Max's Crossing. A bronze statue was commissioned, a German shepherd in mid-stride, head turned slightly, as if looking back for someone who's following. Beneath it, loyalty never gets lost. Maribel didn't disappear again. She didn't go viral. She didn't write a book. But she lived. She got a part-time job at the library, mostly in the back, stocking shelves. She spoke quietly, rarely smiled, but kids loved her. They said she listened better than anyone. Once a month, she visited Max's grave with a fresh flower. Never the same kind twice. One summer afternoon, Kyle stopped by to drop off groceries. She invited him in. The small house was sparse but cozy. A photo of her and Max sat on the windowsill, one taken by Kyle with an old Polaroid, the dog licking her cheek mid-laugh. On the table sat a box, inside scraps of paper, drawings, words. Kyle looked closer. One was a hand-drawn map of the forest, with circles. "Your shelters?" he asked. Maribel nodded. "Places we slept." Another showed a paw print, sketched beside a small figure. A girl. M+M, Kyle said aloud. Maribel smiled. He was the second M. Kyle reached into the box and pulled out one final piece, a piece of bark with something carved into it, rough, simple. He stayed. By fall, she got a dog, not to replace Max. Nothing could. But she adopted a young rescue from a nearby shelter, a skittish, quiet mutt with sad eyes and a nervous tail. It took him weeks to come near her. She named him Echo. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right through the trees on Route 19, people swore they could see something at the edge of the road. Not a ghost, not a trick, just a shape, a shepherd, watching, waiting, and then gone, back into the woods. 10 years later, no one called him the ghost dog anymore. Now he was just Max, the shepherd who waited, the one who remembered, the one who never gave up. His statue stood proud at the edge of Mile 73. Kids posed with it. Cyclists touched its paw for luck. Someone left tennis balls there every week, even though no dog ever came to fetch them. No one knew who. No one needed to. Time passed. Trees grew taller. The highway was repaved. But the story never faded. It was printed in books, taught in local schools, whispered by parents to children when they were afraid of getting lost. Remember, if you're ever in trouble, listen for the bark. Max always finds the ones who need him. Maribel lived quietly. She never moved far from the edge of the woods. She worked in a small animal shelter part-time, painting murals on the walls and teaching kids how to be gentle with shy animals. She never gave interviews, never posted selfies, but she spoke, soft and slow, when it mattered. Kyle still visited, older now, gray in the beard, a little slower on the stairs, but still the same. Some nights they'd sit on her porch in silence, sipping tea, watching Echo, now graying himself, snore at their feet. Once, Kyle asked, "Do you think Max knew what he was doing? The whole time?" Maribel stared out toward the woods. "I think he knew more than we did, about love, about promises, about not leaving." She paused. "And maybe about what happens after." That fall, a school bus broke down on Route 19 near Mile 73. The driver called it in. Nothing dramatic, just a busted radiator. The kids waited patiently, snacking on chips and humming songs. Then one boy, 7 years old, freckles, and a jacket 2 sizes too big, pressed his face to the window and said, "Look!" Everyone turned. At the edge of the woods, just behind the statue, stood a dog. Not a statue, not a shadow. A real one, tall, proud, golden brown fur, a German shepherd, no collar, no leash, just watching. He stood for a few seconds, ears perked, then turned and disappeared into the trees. The kids erupted with excitement. I saw him first. No, I did. He looked at me. The bus driver chuckled and said, "Well, maybe he was just checking on us." But later, when they told the story, none of the kids could agree on the exact details. Some said his fur was darker. Others swore it had gray streaks. One girl said he winked before vanishing. The only thing they all agreed on was this: he made them feel safe. Back in town, Maribel heard the story the next day. She was standing near Max's statue, watering a new row of flowers beneath it, daisies and wild sage. A woman at the farmer's market came rushing over. "You'll never believe it," she said breathlessly. "The kids saw him yesterday at the statue." Maribel smiled. She didn't ask for proof. She didn't need it. She just looked toward the trees and whispered, "I know." Then she turned back to the flowers and kept watering. That night, a breeze stirred through the woods. Leaves danced in the moonlight, and if you had stood on the road just for a moment, you might have seen him, a flash of movement, a strong, silent shape between the shadows, not chasing, not lost, just watching, waiting, still keeping his promise, because some dogs never stop guarding, some bonds never break, and some stories never really end.